Hello and welcome to the video on the reproductive system. So first we need to know the difference between primary and secondary sex organs. Primary sex organs produce and house the sex cells, so that would be the testes in males and the ovaries in females. The secondary sex organs provide the route by which the sex cells unite, so like the vas deferens and the urethra in males, or the fallopian tubes or uterus and vagina in the females. So the male reproductive serves to produce, transport, and introduce mature sperm into the female reproductive tract. So males definitely have the easy job when it comes to reproduction. We need to know the function of the testes. They have two functions. First, they produce sperm. They also produce testosterone. So producing sperm and producing testosterone. And then we need to know why the testes are located outside the body and explain how they regulate their temperature. So they're outside the body because they need to be cooler than our normal body temperature for the sperm to develop properly. And this is sometimes inconvenient and painful, but it needs to be that way so they can be outside the body. And the way they regulate their temperature, you can see on this figure the cremaster muscle and the dartos muscle. So when it's hot outside, those muscles will relax and let the testes hang down away from the body so they can stay cool. If it's colder outside, those muscles contract and pull them closer to the body so they can stay warmer at the right temperature they need. Alright, next we're going to look at some different parts of the reproductive system. So inside the testes, most of the volume is made up of these seminiferous tubules, and that's where the sperm is actually produced inside of them. So they produce sperm. And there's different types of cells inside the seminiferous tubules. The Sertoli cells promote development of sperm. They're sometimes called nurse cells. They provide the right chemical environment and they provide nutrients for the developing sperm. And then you have the interstitial or Leydig cells, and these are the cells that produce testosterone. Then the epididymis is here, sort of on top of and behind the testes. Its function is maturation and storage of sperm. So the sperm are produced in the seminiferous tubules, but the final maturation takes place in the epididymis. Then we have the vas deferens, which takes sperm from the testes to the ejaculatory duct, and they do penetrate the abdominal wall, and that's why there's a weak spot in the abdominal muscles right here in men. That's where most hernias happen. Then the ejaculatory duct takes the sperm to the urethra. Then we have a question, where is testosterone produced? And the correct answer is the interstitial cells of the testes. Alright, next some of the accessory glands. So seminal vesicles, located right here. There's one on each side. They produce 65% of the semen fluid. Their fluid contains fructose, which will nourish the sperm. There's one prostate gland. The urethra runs through it. It produces 30% of the volume of semen. It's an alkaline fluid, which helps to neutralize the acidic environment inside the vagina, so those sperm have a chance of surviving. Then down here is the bulbourethral gland. There's one on each side. They produce 5% of the semen fluid. They produce a basic mucus. It lubricates the urethra, also cleans out any acidic urine that might be left in there. And then the penis is here. Its job is to deposit sperm into the vagina. Then we need to know about some prostate disorders. So benign prostatic hyperplasia, or BPH, is non-cancerous growth of the prostate gland. Usually occurs after age 45. It can obstruct urine flow, so it causes problems that way. Now we have Proscar that can treat this. Prostate cancer is cancer that develops somewhere in the prostate gland. Usually it doesn't obstruct urine flow, so it's not noticed. We don't notice symptoms until they've spread. Prostate cancer right now is the second leading cause of cancer death in men. Next, we need to know the hormones responsible for the onset of puberty in males. So the first one is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, from the hypothalamus, which is going to go to the pituitary and cause the release of follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, from the pituitary, and luteinizing hormone, also from the pituitary. So the follicle-stimulating hormone goes to the testes, tells them to produce sperm. The luteinizing hormone goes to those interstitial cells and tells them to produce testosterone. Then testosterone will cause all the secondary effects like enlargement of the gonads, facial hair, axillary and pubic hair, deepening voice. Then next we need to know the difference between meiosis and mitosis. So most cells in our body undergo mitosis, and if we look above this line, that's mitosis. One cell divides into two cells and they have the same number of chromosomes. But in meiosis, which happens in the testes and in the ovaries, we end up with four cells and they have half the chromosomes as the original cell. And this works out because this cell with half the number of chromosomes will meet an egg with half the number of chromosomes. When they meet, their nuclei fuse together, and you've got one cell with the correct number of chromosomes. Next, we need to know some parts of the spermatozoa. So the head contains the nucleus, that's sort of like its payload, that's the most important part. The acrosome contains enzymes that help the sperm penetrate the egg during fertilization. We'll see that next time when we talk about development. The middle piece, you can see it has lots of mitochondria. It supplies energy. It's like the motor. And then the tail is like the propeller, provides motility. You can see there's no steering wheel. That's why we need so many sperm. There might be 300 million sperm in an ejaculation, and only maybe 100 will actually make it to the egg. Alright, next is the negative feedback loop that controls testosterone levels. So normally hypothalamus secretes GnRH, which causes the pituitary gland to release FSH and LH. LH causes the testicles to produce testosterone. Then testosterone has these inhibitory effects on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, so they'll stop releasing GnRH and LH. So that's what happens if testosterone levels are high. It inhibits release of these hormones, and then we stop making testosterone. If testosterone levels are low, this negative feedback doesn't happen, and we produce more GnRH and more LH, and then we get testosterone produced until it's back to normal. Next, we need to know two key qualities of semen until where it's produced. So its two key qualities are stickiness and alkalinity. The stickiness allows it to stick to the vaginal wall, and the alkalinity allows it to neutralize the acidic environment in the vagina so the sperm can stay alive. Only 1 or 2% of it is actually the sperm cells. Most of it is fluid. Again, 65% of that comes from the seminal vesicles, 30% from the prostate gland, and 5% from the bulbourethral gland. So where do sperm begin development? And correct answer is seminiferous tubules. Seminal vesicles are making the majority of the seminal fluid. The vas deferens transport sperm. The epididymis is where they finish development. Alright, next we're going to look at the female reproductive system. So we need to know first the function of the ovaries. Here's an ovary, there's one on each side. Two functions really: they make the eggs and they also produce estrogen, so very similar to the testes in males. Then the fallopian tubes. So here's a close-up on the ovary. We can see the eggs being produced, and these follicular cells produce the estrogen. Fallopian tubes bring the egg from the ovary to the uterus. They are also called oviducts or uterine tubes sometimes. The ampulla is this part of the fallopian tube. That is where fertilization usually happens. So the sperm make their way up here, and fertilization happens in here. Then the developing embryo will be at the right stage it needs to be when it gets out into the uterus to implant into the uterus. The infundibulum is kind of the end of the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube is not attached to the ovary, so the infundibulum is this expanded area that sort of catches the egg and brings it to the uterus. And the fimbriae are these finger-like projections on the end of the fallopian tube. They make a sweeping motion to pull the egg into the fallopian tube, and then it's lined with ciliated epithelium, which further propel the egg to the uterus. The uterus is where the baby develops, and we'll look at the layers of the uterus next. The vagina serves as the birth canal, serves as a passageway for menstruation. It is also the organ of intercourse for females. Alright, the three layers of the uterus. The perimetrium is the outer layer. It's a serous membrane. It allows it to expand. Myometrium is the middle layer. It is smooth muscle. That is what is going to push out the baby when the baby's too big or big enough. The endometrium is the inner layer. There's two parts of it. The stratum functionalis, that's what sloughs off in menstruation. The stratum basalis attaches the endometrium to the myometrium. So the stratum functionalis, that is the part where an embryo would implant and start to develop. Then we need to know the hormones responsible for the onset of puberty in females. First is gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, so very similar to males. That's going to cause follicle-stimulating hormone to be released from the pituitary. That's going to cause a follicle to develop in the ovary, and the follicle cells then produce estrogen, which cause these secondary effects like growth of the breasts and the reproductive organs, growth of axillary and pubic hair. This is a breast, and we need to know the symptoms of breast cancer. So it affects 1 out of 8 women and one of the leading causes of cancer-related death. Symptoms include a lump in the breast or the armpit. They could be redness, dimpling, or puckering of the skin of the breast, or drainage from the nipple. Now there are 2 cycles that go on in females. There's the ovarian cycle in the ovary, and the menstrual cycle, which is going on in the uterus, and they're happening at the same time. And we're going to watch an animation that sort of describes them.
FSH triggers several follicles
Alright, so this figure shows on the top we have the ovarian cycle and FSH and LH levels, and on the bottom here we have the menstrual cycle. So this is what's going on with the lining of the uterus. This is what's going on with the follicle in the eggs. So talk first about the ovarian cycle. So in the last days of menstruation, low levels of estrogen and progesterone, so you can see those levels have dropped, stimulate the hypothalamus to release GnRH. Then GnRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. Then FSH triggers the follicles on the ovary to resume development, beginning the follicular phase. And as the follicle develops, it secretes estrogen, so that's why estrogen starts to go up here, as well as small amounts of progesterone. As the follicle matures, it migrates to the surface of the ovary. The estrogen levels peak, triggering a spike in LH. The sudden spike in LH causes the follicle to rupture and release the ovum, a process called ovulation. So if you want to predict ovulation, if you want to get pregnant, you can buy an ovulation test kit, which the LH is so high at this point that it can be detected in the urine. So basically you pee on the little test strip and it'll tell you if there's LH, and that's a good time to make a baby. So after ovulation, the fimbriae of the fallopian tube sweep across the top of the ovary to catch the emerging oocyte. The remnants of the follicle remain on the ovary and form the corpus luteum, which marks the beginning of the luteal phase. The corpus luteum secretes large amounts of progesterone, so we can see progesterone rising here, and small amounts of estrogen. The progesterone causes the endometrium to become thicker and more vascular, preparing it for pregnancy. If fertilization doesn't occur, the corpus luteum degenerates into inactive scar tissue called the corpus albicans. Estrogen and progesterone levels fall, causing the endometrium to slough off, resulting in menstruation. So, in case you missed any of that, during the last days of menstruation, low levels of estrogen and progesterone stimulate the hypothalamus to release GnRH. GnRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. FSH triggers the follicles on the ovary to resume development, beginning the follicular phase. As the follicle develops, it secretes estrogen as well as small amounts of progesterone. As the follicle matures, it migrates to the surface of the ovary. Estrogen levels peak, triggering a spike in LH. The sudden spike in LH causes the follicle to rupture and release the ovum, a process called ovulation. Then the fimbriae of the fallopian tube sweep across the top of the ovary to catch the emerging oocyte. The remnants of the follicle remain on the ovary and form the corpus luteum, which marks the beginning of the luteal phase. The corpus luteum secretes large amounts of progesterone and small amounts of estrogen. The progesterone causes the endometrium to thicken and become more vascular, preparing it for pregnancy. If fertilization doesn't occur, the corpus luteum degenerates into inactive scar tissue called the corpus albicans. Estrogen and progesterone levels fall, causing the endometrium to slough off, resulting in menstruation. So that's pretty much the ovarian cycle. Then the menstrual cycle, you have a table to fill out about the menstrual cycle. So the first phase is the menstrual phase. Starts the first day of bleeding. That's days 1 to 5. And the endometrium sheds its functional layer. Then the proliferative phase is days 6 through 14. As the estrogen levels increase, the endometrium is repaired and it grows. Then ovulation is not really a phase, that marks the middle. The secretory phase is days 15 to 26 when the progesterone levels are high, and we can see the endometrium thickening in the secretory phase. And then the last phase is the premenstrual phase, days 26 to 28, when progesterone levels drop and the endometrium basically dies, and then it starts all over again. Alright, next we need to describe menopause. So with age, the ovaries gradually stop producing estrogen. And these declining hormone levels cause the uterus, vagina, and breast to atrophy. They're no longer needed. Some symptoms include hot flashes and mood swings. Then we need to talk about some different birth control methods. So surgical sterilization is cutting the vas deferens or the fallopian tubes that will block the passage of egg or sperm. That is permanent. It is very, very highly effective. An intrauterine device can be placed in the uterus. They prevent fertilization and implantation. If that can't happen, you can't get pregnant. Birth control pills or hormonal methods, they inhibit FSH secretion. They make your body think it's pregnant. So if that's not secreted, the follicle's not going to develop and you're not going to have ovulation. Barrier methods such as condoms block sperm from entering or proceeding past the vagina. And if it can't do that, it can't fertilize an egg. Then finally, behavioral methods. The rhythm method is when you refrain from intercourse when the female is most fertile for about a week. These are not as effective because sometimes it's hard to predict when that's going to happen. Another behavioral method is withdrawal, which is withdrawing the penis before ejaculation. Again, this is not very effective because there is some sperm in the fluid that's released before ejaculation. Alright, review question. A surge in which hormone causes ovulation? And the answer is luteinizing hormone, and I'm pretty sure that will be on your exam.